messages. And hello, we're live, and this is Dcn Joseph Sweden, Orthodox Apologetics Live. It's been shortened to OAL, and basically the reason for that is because we're trying to get more topics, like direct topics on the show. Like this one, you'll notice it's Veneration of Icons, but they become almost unreadable when you're looking at a list. Right now we have I've got a guest co-host today, an interesting person. He's actually been debating Eric Ibarra, who we'll be dealing with next week on our show, and Craig Truglia, correct? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Awesome. So he's been discussing the Orthodox side. Father Enoch was working all night last night, so he wasn't able to do the show. Hopefully, he pops on. And but in any case, just because we need more people to, we like having a dialogue when we do the show. In any case, let's begin. Basically, what we're talking about today is we're talking about the veneration of icons. And so what I'm going to do is I want to touch on Craig's background a little bit because it's interesting because it relates directly to Orthodox apologetics. But what we will be focusing on when we look at text, I'm going to be using as a general scheme for the discussion the icon fact, which is on the FAQ, which is on the Orthodox Christian Information Center. And we'll also touch into a little bit of St. John of Damascus. But anyway, so Craig, this is one of the things that I thought was interesting watching your debate with Eric Ibarra. There aren't too many Orthodox debating Roman Catholics these days, and so this is something we're trying to encourage. So, what made you get interested in doing Orthodox apologetics and discussing? Oh, God Save the Tsar is here. Hey, we'd also like you on. Anyway,
long story short, I wouldn't know if I would really be an apologist. And the reason I'd say that simply is because I'm not ordained in any way. I'm not seminary educated. I'm self-educated, and I'm just a layman and a rather new convert at that. That being said, though, I know Eric back from when I was a Protestant, and in general, it's just an issue that I think we've been debating online for years. And so I believe that Mike from the Reason Theology website said, oh, well, let's just have you two guys debate it. And I think more so it's one, I think Eric's expertise, and also two, the subject matter writes itself. I think the only reason I was able to hold my own in the debates was because I have orthodoxy on my side. So makes it less of a leap.
No, I'll tell you. Listen, I've had debates where basically they flipped because of a sign of the cross. So I totally understand that completely. But one thing is that when it's funny because there's no real official title when it comes to doing apologetics. And what I mean by that is that there's no school that offers a degree in apologetics. As a matter of fact, only one Orthodox seminary, as we've mentioned on the show many times, in this country even offers an apologetics course. So the point is, if you're doing apologetics, you're an apologist. Maybe entry level, maybe top level. The point is, the key is if you do it, you're kind of in it. It's not, that's why I made the joke, your certificate's in the mail.
Yeah, fair enough. And I remember that. I would just say more so for my own personal, walk with God. I want to be careful not to put myself up as any sort of authority.
Absolutely.
If I could restate what other authorities say in a matter that does justice to Orthodox teaching, then I'm very happy with that.
Cool. Well, I'm looking forward to some of your input on, we're going to be talking about veneration of icons. And of course, we can always take questions, even though we're trying to go for more of kind of a topic first, questions later thing. We're still, we're still taking questions freely. I was telling the folks in the chat a funny story yesterday because I got called into a Discord at 11 o'clock. And I'm usually getting ready for bed at around 11 o'clock. And so Matt Slick, if you've ever watched his show, Matt Slick is a constant foil of mine because I've gone on his show a few times. And the point is, somebody calls me into a Discord chat with Matt Slick. And so basically what ends up happening is I have no idea. I'm there for a totally different reason. And what happens is he's like, he's talking. He's basically giving one of the same arguments he gave me before, which is why I was able to answer him so easily. But, it's like, they basically, the people in the chat were like, well, you said call in any Orthodox clergy. So they call me in. He's like, well, I didn't mean that guy because he already spoken to me. And so, of course, he goes through the once saved, always saved thing. And I explained that's from the position of God in John 6, not, man. And he says, well, that's a completely different argument. I'm like, it's kind of a relevant argument if you're talking about assurance of salvation, but you're not God. So the point is, that ended quickly. And I just said, I'm tired and I want to go to sleep. So I just got off the thing and left. But in any case, one of the things that was interesting about the fact that, you were willing to debate, Eric, is we've been trying to get a papal apologist on our show now for, I believe, 36 days, if I'm not mistaken. We've written everybody. It's insane. The Diamond Brothers, who everyone says, oh, talk to the Diamond, they blocked me on Twitter. They've it's people, you'd be surprised at how few people, when you put up a debate request, will actually want to do it. So I'm hoping that that might happen. But in any case, let's see here. It would be really funny. Okay, yeah, Eric is writing about something else. He wants to talk about falsification on Facebook. But I invited him on. I'm like, hey, let's do a preview, and then he just kind of ignored my question. So he's got enough to worry about next week. So. All right, so let's start. If you look at the link that I've put up here, orthodoxinfo.com, general icon fact, this is a great resource. Orthodoxinfo.com is always a great resource because of how long it's been around and how many articles you can find. And so basically, I'm going to skip what is an icon because I assume all of you know what an icon is. I'm going to skip number 2 because I assume that all of you know we don't pray to the icons. We know icons work miracles. Let's skip that. Number 4 is interesting, but I'm not going to really cover it. I'm looking for the things that are interesting on apologetical purposes. So if we go down to question 8, this is one of the most important points that you have to kind of make. And I don't know if I can put up I'll just put up question 8 because it covers a number of scriptural verses, which are primarily found in Exodus and 1 Kings, where it talks about the furnishing of the tabernacle, of the temple, and the sanctuary, so on and so forth. So there's icons everywhere in the Old Testament church. And effectively that passed over into the New Testament church. So when people say, that, keep in mind, all of these verses are after there's no graven images. So the point is, what are these things? Well, they're graven images, if we're going to be technical, but the point is they're graven images that are meant to help in worship. And so that is something to definitely consider, when you're dealing with them. So if you have that on, I'm going to see if I can put them on the screen. Oh, hold on. You were saying, Craig?
It's I would say though that for example, the cherubim in front of the Holy of Holies, the mercy seat rather, would be graven. The general Orthodox practice has been to avoid actual graven images, and that's why we have the icons themselves. There seems to be a sort of scrupulosity to avoid anything in the third dimension, at least in the East. Obviously, that was not true in the West.
Well, in the East, they have a lot of bas relief on the Rizas and stuff like that. So, there is some three-dimensional aspect to it, but not all over, no. But,
that is true. We just don't really have the flat-out statues. I was just looking at I'm watching the World's Great Churches actually on the Great Courses online, Great Courses Plus. And one of my old professors, actually, he's the one teaching the course. And it's, I think the oldest Christian art we have are these solid wood doors. They're wood and they're still there, and they're from 1600 years ago. And you have these stories from the Bible, but it's carved. So yeah, it would be three-dimensional in that extent, but again, not the statue. It'd be interesting to know when the statues actually started being made. I
Well,
don't think
if you look there, there's actually a very few statues that survive from the like 10th to 13th centuries. But what you find is, amazingly, they look pretty flat too. Like, they're three-dimensional insofar as they stand up, but they kind of look like almost like carved icons that stick out a little, but they have flat backs, and they're not exactly like, they don't look like, Our Lady of Grace or anything like that. They just look like, flat statues, if that makes sense. But so you'll notice on rood screens, those the icons that you see occasionally for the cross, even in some Anglican churches, the older ones are flat. It's a common thing. The key thing is that the three-dimensional aspect never goes so realistic that it becomes where it's like action figures, of our Lord and saints. So the point is, it's definitely a different sort of thinking, I guess you could say, in it. But statuary did exist in the West, and if it's done properly, I don't necessarily even think it's a bad thing, but most of it's not done properly.
Well, because again, and this may be getting more to the realm of art history, the point of iconography within the church is not to show something that's the most realistic presentation what we would regularly see. Though, interestingly enough, Eusebius, when speaking of some of the Christian art he saw, was explicit about how lifelike he thought it was being presented. But generally, that's something that would be true of pagan art. Orthodox iconography, the way that it's painted is always kind of like a Thomas Kincaid or Caravaggio, for that matter, bringing the light out of the painting. It's trying to convey a theological reality more than it's trying to convey something that's realistic, per se, unlike the statues we would now kind of think of that Roman Catholics popularly have.
Yeah, no, definitely. There has been a change, and I think the further and further the West got into humanism, then what's it called? It got worse. I guess you could say it reflected both 2- and 3-dimensional realities. Even though, in a sense, I guess you could say our generic artistic skill was becoming sharper. So that's something to keep in mind now. We have, I think it's God Save the Tsar is in the chat, and I wanted to bring him on too, because that way we can make it a whole round table thing. If he's available, give me a second. Hold on. I want to see if I can get him on. Okay. If I can't, it would be cool, but if not, that's fine too. But in any case, cool. I just sent a link. Hold on. And Facebook. So, in any case, let's go back to the icon FAQ, and well, we can even go a little further than that. We'll just jump. I want to jump right to like St. John of Damascus, because he really, if we're going to talk about the iconoclast controversy, and often, as this FAQ points out, Protestants often refer to the iconoclast movement as a Christian one, but ironically, iconoclast didn't sound very much like Protestants either, and so it's an interesting point. But ultimately, what it comes down to, as St. John of Damascus so eloquently put out, that the incarnation is what allows us to make representations. So that's it's a kind of a big deal in that sense, because Christ's incarnation, having come down and having become physical man, means he can be physically represented, and so that's it's kind of a deep theology behind the icon that is sometimes, I wouldn't say it's lacking in the early fathers, because they had different reasoning. Like, for example, St. Gregory, as it's pointed out in an epistle to Serenus, Bishop of Marseille, talks about the educational value of iconography. And I was just reading Over a Life, because it was coming up in my discussions with Matt Slick and Andrew Rappaport, and I had mentioned Saint Juliana of, I'm trying to remember, she was a 17th century ascetic wife and mother, but she was ultimately illiterate. And so she learned from what her husband read to her, what her servants read to her, and what she learned in the church iconography. 17th century. Okay, hold on. Yeah, don't forget to shut off the YouTube. So she learned from what her husband read to her, what her.
Yeah, we're getting feedback.
Yep, we got that now. All right, so I'm trying to think. Now, God Save the Tsar. Is this Scooter or is this Assaulter?
No, this is Scooter.
Hey, Scooter, what's up?
Not much. How you doing, Father? Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. We're gonna have loads and loads of fun. So this is an interesting discussion. And I want to get you guys' feedback on some of like what we're discussing here in terms of iconography. Like, what have you guys ever been confronted with somebody saying don't bow to idols or something to that degree? Like, tell us about your experiences. Hello?
Yeah.
Who's speaking first?
Flip a coin. Who wants to go first?
You want to go, Craig?
Sure, I'll go first. I'm
right.
not sure if I'm the newest convert here. In short, you would hear just the commandment quoted to you from Exodus, and then usually you just respond simply like what we started the show with. You say something simple like, well, the temple had cherubim, and there was the curtains had cherubs woven into them, and things to that effect. So it's not the image itself that's banned. And I mean, even among Protestantism, we have children's Bibles and stuff. So usually, but that's like a sidestep, right? Because the issue that you brought up was, well, you're bowing to this thing, you're venerating this thing. That's their objection, but the Bible passage they use to justify their objection really doesn't address that, if that makes sense. So they're really two different issues. When it comes to veneration itself, what's interesting is that veneration's demanded of you within Orthodoxy. So even if we allow for iconography for artistic reasons, we don't say that the actual representation is wicked. It's good in many ways. That still wouldn't be getting at the full point of it. The real point of the iconography ultimately is veneration, which is why St. Gregory the Great's defense of iconography may be popular in the West, but really is not. It doesn't capture the essence of what it means in the East.
Yeah, I think for me, so I think Craig, you brought up some really good points. I think for me, both my parents are Protestants, so they're not too pushy. They're not particularly religious, but it's definitely been brought up. It's a violation of the Second Commandment. And I've always kind of gone to the defenses that you guys went to. But something I did early on, back when I was still a Roman Catholic, was I read. I'll highly recommend it. St. John of Damascus on holy images. I think it's actually called Apology Against Those Who Decry Holy Images. I think that's the. I'm
going to put a link of it in the chat because it is available online.
Yeah, that's an excellent read. I think for anybody, I was actually just speaking to a kid today who has questions about it, especially because St. John, he's so scripturally based. So if you're talking with Protestants and they're going to bring up scripture, you can use some of his arguments that are it's foundational, or excuse me, he's using scripture as a foundation. And that was what I did, and that was kind of what helped me refute some of their arguments. But yeah, that's about it.
Well, I think that I think both of you bring up very good points. And to the first one, to what Craig brought up, that's covered in the icon FAQ, but I should mention it as well that's also a carryover from Jewish practice. They did actually kiss holy items, and they did actually venerate them, which wasn't considered worship.
Yes.
But, the point is that's something that, again, like even when you're talking about praying the Psalms daily, so on, this comes from temple practice. So these are things that we as the new Israel take into our account in our worship. It's sad because one of the things that is actually mentioned in this FAQ is the Dura Europos synagogue, which was right near the Dura Europos house church, both of which had rich iconography of the time. Unfortunately, the information in that is somewhat dated since ISIS, because 90% of Dura Europos has been destroyed. So,
Father, can I add something about what you were speaking about earlier?
Sure.
So just about Roman Catholic statues, I don't want to rail against Catholics too hard here. Again, I was a Catholic for a very long time.
I think, well, I was also, so that's fine.
Yeah, yeah. But I view like some of that, some of the statues from like the Middle Ages and a little bit later even as almost just like pagan artwork with Christian dressing. It's very sexual in nature, very emotional, and just kind of odd from traditional Christianity. I mean, think about even the idea of like going into the Vatican and you're seeing like naked Greek gods.
Well, yeah. I think we brought that up in a previous show. That if you look at Michelangelo's stuff, I mean, half of he paints a naked Christ.
Right.
He had actually paint loincloths on.
Right. It was later covered up. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. But that's my point. That the people who were painting this stuff. I mean, I don't want to, I understand they're important works of art and blah, blah, blah. Oh, but to be used in worship, it's almost a sacrilege.
Right, right.
And so, yeah, no, I would agree that and there is, and I think even if you're looking at the old statuary, it's in practice very similar to raised Byzantine iconography. I'm pretty sure that one could easily do the other. And I think that, in defense of the iconographers who fled to Rome during the iconoclastic period, that's part of the reason why the similarity is so obvious, because the same traditions and the same patterns were being used in the practice of making even that old statuary, which barely exists today. So I can't even point you to a church where there's like, oh, well, this is what the statuary looks like. No, that's all gone. It's been replaced, and it wasn't replaced by iconoclasts. It was replaced by people who wanted this new sensual artwork to take over.
Right.
So, in any case, we did get a question, so we'll toss that out. And this is this is one that has riled us to no end. Sean Ridlin asks, are you going to cover the Ancients of Ages? I assume he means the Ancient of Days icons depicting God the Father. We've had this discussion. We actually had a guy who was fighting with us and wanted to debate and began saying things about my wife and Father Enoch, and I just said, well, I'm going to block him, who was vehemently, quote-unquote, defending the God the Father icon. And the reason I say vehemently defending is because of the fact that, I'll tell the story again. My wife, as an iconographer, and I've heard this from other iconographers, says that technically the God the Father icon is considered an incorrect depiction. That said, people have used them, have venerated them, have loved them for ages. Well, that wasn't good enough for the guy that was, debating with us, because he wanted us to say that it is perfectly and conformably Orthodox. But no one ever said that in Orthodox history. You might find one or two people defending the icon, one or two people attacking the icon, say not attacking it even, but just saying it's not correct. And this going back and forth. It's like 4-part harmonies in music, and someone says, if you do not do monophony, you're all anathema. It doesn't make any sense. So, I mean, the question of, whether or not it's correct, but in any case,
I have some comments on that. Now I live in Syracuse, but recently I lived near Holy Trinity Monastery in Jordanville. And these are all central New York locations. I don't know where the audience is. And that being said, Holy Trinity Monastery, obviously the Trinity, and they have representations of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit in the icons. And so you have, the Spirit as a dove icon, you have the Father as an icon. And I have to say, personally, the reason I don't like it, and maybe it's good if we disagree on this or agree, I don't know, is simply because it kind of undoes. It undoes St. John of Damascus' whole argument that no one's seen the Father, but Christ has made him known. I've heard it argued that, well, maybe the Ancient of Days, some church fathers thought it was Christ, which is a kind of hard interpretation, being that the Son of Man sits at the right hand of the Ancient of Days. And I know I just read St. Hippolytus' commentary on Daniel, and he also identifies Ancient of Days with the Father. Yes, we have this visual description of the Father in Daniel 7. But like I said, it kind of undoes the rhetorical force of the theology for icons that we have. So that's why, like, okay, it looks nice and all, but I don't personally feel comfortable venerating it as a matter of conscience.
Okay. Well, no, I think that those are very good points. To that end, I would say that, I mean, obviously people will say, well, Christ is the image of God the Father, and I'm really playing devil's advocate here, because the truth of the matter is I like them both. The core-screwed icon, which is one of the most venerated images in road course history, had God the Father on it. I knew somebody who was getting very involved in theological arguments, 2 decades ago, and he photoshopped out the Father. I think when you're doing stuff like that, it's tacky. But the truth of the matter is, is Andrei Rublev's depiction of the Trinity the most perfect? I think most of the church fathers would say, yeah. I mean, the later church fathers after Rublev. So it's that's something to I don't want it to become too much of a discussion about art, but I do want to stick to people calling us idolaters. But it's because that is important. One of the aspects of, as Scooter brought up, the St. John of Damascus's argument is, of course, we talk about the veneration passing from the image to the prototype. So when you kiss an icon of Christ, you are not kissing the icon per se. You're sending your love to Christ. And so this is something that I think is lost on people, even though we do it naturally all the time. I mean, I hate to say it, but kind of, if you've ever seen someone, look at a picture or hold a picture of a dead relative, humans do that almost instinctually.
No, definitely. It's, it's natural. I remember when, my wife was discerning Orthodoxy. She's converted with me. And, this comes up like, okay, well, it's one thing to have the pictures, but they're kissing them. And, how's this not worship? And I go, well, have you ever kissed a photo of me? Are you worshiping me? She said, well, no. So there's a difference. It's how we show affection. And so, and like you said, not that I know as much about ancient Jewish practice, but like it's even mentioned in the gospel where Christ says that we still have where, David's buried to this day. Why do they have his gravesite? It was obviously a site of pilgrimage and veneration. And, and we see that in early Jewish documents in the 1st, 2nd century, 3rd centuries. So it's, like I said, it's natural to do that. And being that God's omniscient, obviously, that's how an icon works as a window into heaven. That when we show affection to God, God does receive that affection. And the same would be true of the saints.
Yeah, so definitely. Okay, we've got another question. Sean came in with a second one. Can you speak on icons depicting new or local saints? When does it become proper to venerate an icon, say of Father Seraphim of Platina or Matushka Olga? I know Father Seraphim of Platina. I have no idea who Matushka Olga is.
Don't know who she is either.
What?
I don't know who she is either.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was going to say
she's locally venerated, really, in Alaska. It's kind of a push in the OCA to have their first female saint in North America.
Oh,
I don't think it ever will happen. But I'm sorry, what?
I said, please tell me this isn't about the feminism.
I mean, maybe a little bit. I don't doubt that she was very godly, and I don't doubt there's legitimate veneration in Alaska. But the kind of push outside of Alaska seems to me for that reason. It's a little bit, yeah.
Well, it's got one way or another. If it's one of the things that's interesting about, especially when we start talking about saints and icons, and their local veneration, is how veneration in Orthodoxy is always an organic thing. So Sean knows. So Sean knows this thing. He said he lived in Alaska for 15 years. Okay, so my point is that if people are going to venerate the saint, it's going to happen whether we like it or not. I remember when St. John of Shanghai was glorified in Rokor, and Rokor still wasn't actually united to the Moscow Patriarchate or anything like that. But I remember when it started, you started seeing icons slowly appearing. Even though churches weren't in communion with Rokor, they just started appearing. And that's kind of what happens. Eventually, the church recognizes her saints. And that's always going to be the case. I think another example of that is with Metropolitan St. Philaret. His icons are appearing more and more places too. Father Seraphim of Plotina is a very interesting case because he's actually been formally glorified by one true Orthodox body, I think the Artok, but nobody else has. But do people venerate him as a saint? I think a lot of people already do. As to the question of when it becomes official, I don't think saints officially help us. Saints personally help us. And I think, if somebody feels that, a saint helped them, they're going to back that up. And I think that that's the way it's always worked. I remember when one thing to keep in mind, for example, is that during the schism, during the Great Schism of 1054, after the death of Patriarch Michael Carolarius, they wrote services to him. They put him in the calendar. Where is he now? He's gone. Nobody venerated him. Nobody believed in him. Nobody got any, they didn't see any, real thing happening. And that's why he's not in the church calendar now. In other words, I wouldn't worry so much. I think that you can't put the halo on the icon until there is an actual glorification by a synod. But I don't think that it's, it's not up to us, especially when we're talking about new saints and saints that are, new to heaven, that we can simply say, well, you got to wait until there's an official approval. You should. And there's cases where suspect people have been pushed forward as potential.
I mean, there's a push for Rasputin among some circles.
That's crazy. Yeah, I know. But that's been going on for like 25 years. I really.
There's Rocor priest way behind Rasputin, and I think it has more to do as a way of defending Tsar Nicholas indirectly than really anything else. But that's the thing. I mean, or we'll take guys like Cairo Lucaris, who's canonized by the Church of Alexandria, no minor church, and and people go, well, we don't accept him.
Well,
so
what's interesting is that there were actually I think it was Saint Nicodemus, but there were actually saints in the 17th century who wrote services for Lucaris. So I mean, I don't know.
He was martyred for the church. Say, what you like or don't like about some of his questionable diplomatic moves to the Reformed and whatnot, but the man was martyred. Saint Hippolytus was a schismatic, but he was martyred. So we have more than a few saints that are like that.
Now, someone pointed out, I've seen a Stalin icon. I've seen a Putin icon. I mean, I've seen some crazy. Putin might have actually ordered that himself, but in any case.
I mean, I'll just add to buttress Dcn Joseph's point. I mean, I personally venerate Father Seraphim as a saint. I mean, I pray for his intercession. I have no problem doing that. I believe he's a saint. And I think you brought up the proper word there, which is organic. That's basically the way these type of things happen. There's an organic following. There's a cult following, if you will. Not to use that word in the derogatory sense, but there's a people who grow and learn to love a saint, and then it's slowly, people start making depictions of them, and then, there's miracles that happen, and then slowly it gets recognized by the church. It's really an organic process. And I see that happening in not too long, just in the case of Father Seraphim. I mean, he has followings now, and not just the United States, in Greece as well.
Russia,
yeah. And I remember some of the I saw actual translations of Father Seraphim Rose's works that were actually samizdat. They were actually like underground publications during the Soviet period.
Oh, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, no, he was very heavily respected and is heavily respected in Russia and in other places. Let's see if we're looking for more comments. We've got I have a Condrano icon, praying that he gets canonized one day. I think that's I don't know. Saint Constantine, he has an icon. We know that. And apparently, he has muscles.
I haven't seen about icons, but I haven't seen one of Father Daniel Sisev.
I have
pronounced it. Oh, you have?
Yeah.
There's a martyr and a great writer, and really a young guy who, it's a.
He did apologetics.
Oh yeah, it's a great apology. And so, yeah, no, I pray for his intercession in the morning. And so, yeah, it's like you said, really, it only becomes validated really through miracles. People they start appearing in people's dreams, these saints, and miracles start happening. And usually, I mean, maybe it's a condescension to, I don't know, our human emotions, but that tends to be what happens. That's what pushes a lot of these saints, over the edge, and they get enough votes and they enter the Hall of Fame, so to say.
I think it's more that they already had it, but they simply had to be asked. Because remember that if we assume it's us making them a saint, then I mean, so many people with really pious grandmothers right now would probably have a lot. They'd have saints in their family. But what it ultimately comes down to is that the sanctity of the saint is what brings them to that, to that level. I've seen a couple of icons of Father Seraphim Rose. I haven't. I mean, I saw that. I will get into one thing that's weird about a modern trend, and that is to put halos on photos. And I find that disturbing because a photo it's supposed to depict a physical reality, whereas an icon's supposed to depict a spiritual one. And so I don't know how you guys feel about that, but if you've seen that in recent provenance, people will just put kind of like icons on photos of different fathers or whatever.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it started with the Copts, but that's big among them because whenever their dad dies, because I mean they've got martyrs seems like every month, quite frankly. They start printing them on shirts and stuff, and they'll superimpose halos and crowns and things to that effect, and so it seems to be something that has spread from the fact that people remembering their family members, and I think it's probably spread from there, from the Egyptians, would be my guess.
And now, well, I think the veneration of saints in general has been going on everywhere in the church, but yeah,
I mean,
that was the photo thing. Yeah, that's true. I think you actually made a good point when you brought up that people put them on T-shirts. I mean, people do that in even in American neighborhoods when someone gets killed, like one of their kids and stuff like that. Yeah. And there's kind of an emotional aspect to it that's not, it's not altogether the same, but I get what you're saying. And now Amal Ibatulan, yeah. Opinions on venerating Nicholas II as a saint. I'm pretty sure we all do.
I mean, isn't that settled?
Yeah, he's a royal new martyr. Yeah, we do venerate him as a saint. Yeah. Sean Ridlin says, please keep going to cover the process of canonization, especially as contrasted to the papists. It was the same process up until Rome started formally glorifying, canonizing saints, and they started that really late, like 100 years before the schism. But even then, they were still doing it as the local bishop of Rome, which would be expected. Where it became a more complicated process was well after the schism. The church has always, wanted to understand miracles were occurring from the person, but it was never as strange formal process as it is. Sure, we usually just entered people into the calendar, and then they survived or they didn't. I hate to say that, but that's the way most of the saints of the calendar exist.
Yeah, let me also point out there that post-Vatican II, the Roman Catholic Church also changed their canonization process again. So it used to be real tough to get somebody canonized. There had to be like X number of miracles, just like you're saying, this very legalistic process. Now they took out the devil's advocate who used to argue against the canonization, and now like there's like less miracles. So that's why people like JP2 are canonized, like Mother Teresa, like just like 20 years or so after their deaths.
And then again, they're like fast tracked,
Yeah, well, that amazed me that like Mother Teresa and John Paul II were like instant saints because they had a lot of TV time.
Right, exactly.
But now let me see here. I think that thoughts on cross necklaces and saint bracelets. They have saint bracelets.
Well, yeah, like you've seen the ones with Mary Guadalupe and the Hispanics wear them around
bracelets. Bracelets. Okay, no, it said braces, and I was like, wow. I was like putting them on your teeth. That's what I thought. But that was weird. Okay, no, yeah, I mean, crosses on your neck, wearing a crucifix is normal. It's typical. Saint bracelets. I mean, there aren't many of them in Orthodoxy. I've seen a couple of things like that. Yeah, they do have them. I've seen a couple of Greek stores that had them, and I've seen people wear pins of saints too. There's nothing wrong with wearing a pin of an icon. You know, it's an interesting talking point. One of the things I wanted to bring up, because Scooter, you mentioned, you know, the new Vatican II process, but we also have to remember the flip side, that saints that have been recognized by tradition historically just got kicked out of the calendar because there was quote unquote insufficient evidence to keep them.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's so true. You know, that's kind of a strange thing, but you know, what are you gonna? It's like almost like tradition has to be rechecked.
Yeah, you also have the problem of like the Chaldean Catholics, and Assault Rifle told me this. I didn't know this, and had I known when I was a Catholic, I would have been livid. But the Chaldean Catholics venerate Nestorius as a saint, but the Roman Catholics view Nestorius obviously as a heretic.
Well, they have to view him as a saint too, because he's in a calendar of theirs. So I didn't know that. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, the Roman Catholicism is a mixed bag with that. I mean, you know. Saint Mark of Ephesus is a saint because the Ukrainians that are Catholics, and obviously they went to schism quite a bit after the Council of Florence. So
now, if Father Enoch was here, I will say I would speak on his behalf because he's mentioned this, because I brought it your exact point up, and he said one thing to remember is that after Vatican II, they added a lot of these saints to the calendar to make the churches look more Eastern, but they weren't originally there. I'm pretty sure Saint Photius was. St. Mark of Ephesus, I'm not. I certainly know St. Seraphim of Sarov wasn't, because just the time period. But, okay, and let's see here. We're getting more questions. I have seen some people getting tattoos or crosses of Kairos. Is this a sin by any chance? Is it completely fine, or is it just not advisable? Interesting question. Well, I do know that I've read about, I think it was a Coptic family in Jerusalem. They do like these like tattoos that I guess they've said have been done for hundreds and hundreds of years, and so on and so forth. I mean, I'm not a big fan of tattoos to begin with, but that's, I mean, I knew even clergy who had them from their former lives. They didn't have to have them removed. So I'm not a big fan of tattoos. I personally think you shouldn't mark your body. But if a person's going to do that, I would prefer a cross as opposed to something obscene.
It's the piggyback off that. The Copts did it, but it was started by the Muslims. They would mark off. It was like this Jewish Star of David. They would forcefully tattoo them with crosses. And, you know, God bless the Copts. They actually take pride in the fact that they're oppressed. They see it as that God has set them apart. And it validates their view that, you know, Christ promises persecutions to his church, that they are the church. And so that's why they now have it. It's a rite of passage to get that tattoo. But it didn't originate as a Christian practice. It originated, the Muslims foisted it upon Christians. I do know when it's a Holy Trinity.
But when you think about that, it's defiling a person's body.
I'm sorry?
I was saying, I think that's actually horrifying because, you know, they're basically like, they're branding, defiling a person's body if they don't have tattoos. It's just like, you know, and then now it's kind of seen, I mean, they're seeing it as a positive, but it's still, I'm still not a big fan of tattoos. It's just me.
Like Holocaust survivors getting the numbers tattooed on their arms out of pride of their family making it through. It's sort of twisted. It's a bit of complex of sorts. But that being said, I do know at Holy Trinity Monastery, they're super against tattoos. Doesn't mean there aren't monks that from the former lives, they may have tattoos. But no, they were not to get them. And I would say, you know, though I would not want to quote, you know, I think it's Leviticus where it teaches against it as the really proof text against it, because I think that would be reading that passage out of context. I don't see the justification for tattoos. I mean, the scriptures obviously teach.
Yeah, they condemn the practice. Yeah.
Yeah, but the scriptures teach that we should have humility and we should not be outwardly adorning ourselves in the way to oppress other people. And so when someone gets a tattoo, what's their motivation? It's always, it looks cool, you know, or this or that, and it really where's this edifying motivation, and then that's motivation, and that's why we should. I think from that alone would discount almost every single tattoo we could imagine, whether it's Christian or not. I don't see how it conforms to what the scriptures say that Christians should be conducting themselves in humility.
Yeah,
I'd agree with that. Yeah, totally. We have another question. Can you talk about the process of creating icons? Can you venerate a paper icon, etc.? We'll go with the two different questions. Who wants to? Anyone want to jump on the first one, or should I?
You should.
Okay, fine. Icons are generally created through prayer. They're created through prayer. You start with a certain number of prayers. Iconographers are traditionally trained in how to mix colors, in a variety of different ways. And then depending on what school they learned, because there are different schools of iconography, they begin the process of layering. Usually the icon is drawn out first. When it's a fresco, there's usually a hole punching process almost to kind of create an outline to work with. The standard norms vary. Most Arabic iconography is very different from, say, modern Byzantine iconography. But when you get to 12th century Byzantine iconography, Western, Spanish, Latin they all look very, very similar. So there are certain things that are kept. There are certain canons that iconographers follow in terms of stylistically how they design the icon. And so they have to follow and if the icon was painted before, they have to take care to follow and emulate. They can't innovate in the production of icons. So when you see people be like, oh, here's a new icon, it's brand new, there's a lot of people who always look at it kind of like, side-eyed, and there's a reason for that. And it's because if it's not part of the tradition, even slight deviations often can cause people to be like, wait, I don't know if can you do that? And it's a valid question, because we're supposed to be kind of reproducing that spiritual reality. You guys have any extra thoughts on that?
I don't know, made me just think of like some of the churches built in Russia really after Peter the Great. And you would think that they had Italian painters, and I know they had Italian architects. I don't know about the painters, but apparently they did. It's there's obviously a certain affect from the iconography, and like what you're referring to before, the what makes a canonical icon is what makes it portray Orthodox theological realities. And really the tried and true method of that is always just bringing the light out of the painting. I can't help but feel when I see any other sort of icon, it just seems wrong. To answer the question though, about paper icons and things to that effect, I mean, it doesn't matter. It could be cheapo, it could be reprinted, it really doesn't matter. I mean, there's been miracles, through icons that were once described in Mountain of Silence, that it was a piece of paper that was almost thrown out, right? It was just printed on this piece of paper and it was pretty much garbage. And I think most churches now aren't even getting painted icons. They're just having massive prints done. And I
think that's actually a terrible practice, and I'll tell you why.
Sure.
It saves money, which is nice. But the problem is there's no sense of permanence. And what I mean by that is even in our, some traditional Orthodox churches I've seen in Greece, so on and so forth, they've had these paper icons, these giant wallpaper prints, effectively, and they start to crack. If you're doing a lot of sensing in the church, so on and so forth, they will crack. And one of the things that was important about frescoing the icons on the walls of the churches, if they had frescoes at all, because of course some churches just had portable icons, but the point is, if you're going to make a permanent type icon, sometimes the people guarantee it'll last 100 years. Of course, we'll all be dead by then, so you don't know if it's going to last 99. So the point is, the key is that it wasn't meant to last through the ages. If you look in some of these monasteries where they were, these icons were painted in the 7th, 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, and they're fine now. there's a value to that permanence that you can't replace with a paper icon.
And some of it is that when it's painted and starts falling apart, it kind of adds character to it, while this messed up wallpaper looks like messed up wallpaper. Because what's the one that I forget which city in Russia, the one in Vladimir, the Theotokos, and it's it's pretty much falling apart, but people do reprints of the picture falling apart.
Oh yeah,
because it adds to its character.
That's like the icon, like all the reprints are actually of the cover. I don't know if you know that, but the cursed root icon is actually like green. So you know that the blue reprint that you see, that's actually the protection of the cursed root.
Yeah, that's the cover. Yeah.
The I do know, like, because let's say what's going on in Russia, the church is growing so quickly, they don't have nearly enough priests, nearly enough churches. And I know that in my wife's country, the Russians have built 2 churches. And so it's, long story short, they're not painting there because they couldn't bring iconographers to Cambodia. And in a lot of these parts in Russia, they can't build churches and fill them with priests fast enough. And so it's maybe a less than ideal practice, but it's certainly better than nothing. And in fact, and one thing I'm noticing, I think, maybe not in Europe because they wouldn't stand for it, but because of Protestantism being what it is in the United States, is that a lot of Orthodox churches here practically have no icons.
Yeah.
Because it's expensive. I mean, the United States, I mean, you're going to paint some of your walls. It's going to cost as much money as the building, quite frankly, if you're going to have all the walls decked out. And in some ways, then you go, okay, well, then that isn't going to happen because we're not going to find, someone that's going to paint all these walls for, less than $300,000, then maybe they should, because what better making your church look good than your house. But it's to some extent, I think there needs to be some flexibility with the technology, not to have cheap reprints or something. But I mean, like, I've noticed a lot of the icons that you come in and kiss, they always use something that's waterproof. And for that reason, because it's getting so much more kissing than the stuff on the walls. So it's, I think, something that could be done with discernment. But then again, your wife's a professional iconographer, so I can't speak. I'm just speaking as a guy that's looking at pictures on the walls and not much else.
Well, the thing is, the first thing she would say is that it's expensive. So the point is, it is an expensive process to get a real iconographer to go do all the walls. And, I think it can be a mix of the two. It doesn't have to be one or the other. If you can have all the icons start out for real on, say the iconostas, and then move your way out piece by piece, then that's a good way to go forward. But again, if the most affordable way is to put up, the wallpapered icons, I'm not against that either. I'm simply saying that from a practical standpoint, you're going to have to be thinking, decades ahead to when it's time to replace that.
Yeah, and I don't know about you guys, it'd be a good question to put out to everyone. I mean, what do you do with your old icons? Like, I kind of hope not to be giving them, because I retain them. I'll even retain, like, cards that have an icon on them.
Our church calendars, I keep them.
Yeah, and so then, like, because you can't just throw it out, and then now I feel obligated. I have to pray to that saint.
Well, I'll just keep at it. All right. Well, we're gonna cover real quickly Mickey Mick's question, then I want to get to Sean's next question. Mickey Mick said, "I read there are saints icons that are specific to certain field, like Saint Matthew is to accountants. How does that work exactly?" I'm not aware that. I mean, Orthodoxy doesn't have as heavy a tradition of patron saints like that. It's possible, but I don't think it's probable. Like, I've heard, like, if you pray to Saint Senya, for example, of Petersburg, when you need a job, she's very helpful with that. But I wouldn't call her the patron of the unemployed or anything like that. I mean, I'm not sure that it's that regimented in terms of, like, you can ask this saint, because there's lots of saints who will help you. We just don't know which ones do which at any given point, and it could be the ones that talk to you. That's really what it comes to.
My understanding, my wife's Russian. She's actually from Kursk. She lived there for 20 years. is that it's more common in Russia than it is in other Orthodox countries, which I personally probably think that comes from Latin influence. But just from speaking with my wife and reading up a bit on it, it is pretty common to them to pray to specific saints in a similar way that Roman Catholics do for like specific things.
Oh yeah, well no, that makes sense. But the Roman Catholic practice is often kind of like, okay, let's take this to a vote. We're going to put this saint to this saint. And that I don't think they do that.
Yeah. No.
Great question from Sean. We're going to start here. Please talk about proper disposal of printed icons like on our church's Sunday bulletins. I hear we shouldn't be throwing these away. I don't know about you guys, but I think I think Craig mentioned that he doesn't. I don't. Insofar as I can, what I do is I try to cut them out, and then I try to see if you can find a matching frame at, say, the Dollar Tree or something, because then you have a brand new Festal icon. Oh, sorry. That was something I was typing in another chat with. No, I'll answer both questions. Will answer questions. I had another chat I typed in by mistake. But in any case, yeah, so, the more icons, the merrier. Now, some people say, well, I don't want to get the same icon every year. Well, no, that's great. Then you have different icons. And how many people, think about this, how many times have you been in discussion with somebody about icons or about Orthodoxy, and somebody says, well, it would be nice to have an icon. Well, you've got dozens of them. So the point is, now you have, now that you have your Festal icons, you have icons you can hang on the wall throughout the house, to give to friends, to give to, the point is there's lots and lots of different things you can do with them. So, yeah, you don't have to throw them away. I mean, I presume if you are going to throw it, I'd leave them in the back of a church or something. I wouldn't throw them away, and I wouldn't burn them. I assume that you could do that. Okay, now, Kimber Mildred asks, hypothetical question that I probably know the answer to. Could miracles be done from an e-icon, for instance? I'm not for e-icons necessarily, but I'm just curious.
What?
E-icons. I assume it's you know how they have those digital picture frames? Like if you put an icon in a digital picture frame, then what? Like can myrrh exude? Well, it can if God wants it to. I mean, if you're not using it for anything else. If myrrh can exude from paper, it can exude from your tablet. It might break your tablet, but it can also exude from your tablet.
I just think but then that kind of speaks to what we were saying before. What makes an icon is that, you're drawing light out of the painting. And so it's, bringing your focus to these heavenly realities. How would that work with I guess, a medium that requires light emitting diodes? That's right. I'm not sure if it would work. I don't think that means you can't project a picture of an icon. Let's say you were showing icons in the show and you want to project them on the screen. I think that'd be fine, but I'm just not sure how that'd work in a veneration context.
Well, I mean, I think you could treat your digital icon so long as you have the image on the screen. If you keep it there, pretty permanently, you could venerate it. I would aim to get a more permanent form of an icon, though, just because you may not have one, and if you don't have one, that's understandable. But then make one. Just go to Kinko's or ask somebody with lots of extra icons like us. So that would be I would say it to me, it seems like the question would be, if you're using a digital icon for prayer, it's fine. You probably don't want it to exude myrrh because it will probably damage your device.
And yeah, and then, then it could be something satanic, right? Because he'd be destroying your computer.
Well, I don't know. I think if God was to exude icon through a digital to exude myrrh through a digital icon, he would do it in a way that would not damage it. But it's a tough question.
No, God would do it in a way that wouldn't damage it. Satan would damage your computer.
Well, Satan wouldn't exude myrrh. I don't think that would be weird. But in any case, it's an interesting theoretical question. If it boils down to what you're using, if that's what you have for an icon, don't stop using it. Just get a paper one when you can, at least. But in any case, yeah. So if there's more questions, we're here for another few, and then we'll wrap it up. I did want to touch on. One thing I want to touch on, since we've covered, the veneration of icons, various questions of icons. Again, for everyone who has been following and just wants to get a recap of everything related to icons, I'm putting the link up again to orthodoxinfo.com. Take a look at that. It answers a lot of the major questions on icons, including the scripture verses where imagery is used, and deals with other arguments that you may encounter concerning them. Okay, let's see here. So, let's see. Next up.
I don't know if you have a question, but I've been asked by a Protestant that why does Orthodoxy require that you venerate the icons? Like, what if someone out of personal conviction just didn't want to do it? They weren't against them, weren't against other people doing it. They weren't against praying to the saints. They prayed to the saints, but they just did not want to do it with an icon. I'm just interested in your comment on that because I know someone posed that to me.
Well, I think that I mean, at least you know, and I want to get Scooter's input on this, but at least from my perspective, what I found is that when people don't venerate icons, but they formally claim to be Orthodox, there's something hidden. It's something that's not right there. And what I mean by that is icons, if you're praying to saints and you understand them in a more in a real way, like not an academic way, not a mental way, but in a spiritual way, that they're real and they're alive and they're with us, then seeing pictures of them shouldn't produce revulsion. It should. I would be like a person who's asking that question. Now, the person who's asking you that question is not Orthodox. So yes. Clearly, the point is he hasn't quite made that leap yet to understand that icons represent a spiritual reality that we actually live in, because they don't live in it. This is one thing that we've especially learned here on this show and debating with Protestants, is that the concept of saints alive in Christ, even after our physical death, is lost upon people. And so it's scary. You know, it goes from anywhere from seeing it as a pagan practice to ancestor worship. But the point is, what it's not dealing with is that we don't see the saints as dead. We see them as alive. And so a picture of a living person in Christ shouldn't produce revulsion. And so I would say that in that end, I would be asking more questions. If I was trying to see what were this person's objections to the church, I would be asking more questions about how they see those reposed in Christ, how they see them, you know, as whether they, you know, understand that they're with us now, and things like that. Because those are because that's really what the iconography of the church kind of reflects. So when you see people like kind of nervous about that, it's because they're very nervous about that context. Scooter?
Yeah, I'll add. I have some input here. So it's interesting, Craig, you brought that up, because I actually had somebody ask me the same question, because I believe the Seventh Council states not just that it's acceptable to venerate icons, but that Orthodox Christians must venerate icons. So I think it's a reasonable question. I would say maybe I'm being a little bit harsh here, but I would say it could be an implicit rejection. And this is kind of what Dcn Joseph was saying. You could look at it as maybe an implicit rejection of the communion of saints. And arguably, again, here now I'm stretching a little further, even the incarnation. Because if you think about St. John of Damascus' Apology, a major part of the reason that we depict Christ, we depict the saints, is because Christ became incarnate, right? Because we saw Christ, because people actually walked with Christ. So one's unwillingness to venerate that icon seems like it could be sort of an implicit rejection. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, and I think that really you want to ask more questions, you know, without necessarily being confrontational, but you want to ask more questions as to how they see the communion of saints, in language that they understand, of course, because a lot of people, when you say the communion of saints, have no idea what you're talking about. But yeah, definitely, that'll probably bring more questions to the forefront about how we see the saints, and that will help a person understand, you know, how they're alive in Christ and why their being there isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing. Father,
I think the defender of the depictions of God the Father is back in the chat.
I'm losing Crawford.
Well, yeah. Okay. Well, we'll get to him. But right now, Would you consider Atomic Lead asks, would you consider Charlemagne heterodox for wanting to overturn the Seventh Council that ruled in favor of them? There's apparently controversy over whether the canons of the council were poorly translated, and Charlemagne may have been reacting to that. I think there's actually a pretty good argument for Charlemagne being a saint. Even though that he did have many, sins that were recorded in his life, as most leaders who eventually were glorified as saints were. The fathers of the Orthodox West before the schism seemed pretty convinced he was a saint just by his, his behaviors and his piety. I think that he made errors, certainly with the filioque and with his views on the Seventh Council, but I wonder how much of that was political. And I don't know that I would be willing to label him as heterodox just because of the time period where the controversies themselves were given rise. So I'd be very uncomfortable with just jumping on he's a heterodox board that, like Romanedians and so on do as well. Kippering Crawford wrote, anyone who claims that it's not proper to paint icons of the Father according to traditional Orthodox norms is ignorant of the theology, history, and tradition of the Orthodox Church and is in error. Unfortunately, you will find that there were saints, fathers, and councils who spoke about those icons, and some of them did not speak of them in the high praises to which you speak to them. And I'm not going to debate further on that because of the constant and insulting methods and manners in which you've spoken towards myself, my wife, and Father Enoch on, in our chat board. No, I'm not letting you on. You can keep making sock accounts, and you're still wrong. So let's continue. Mickey Mick. There is an icon of Christ in my Orthodox study Bible that I keep hidden from family and friends. Well, that's, if they don't like icons, he's probably best to keep them in there. So because you don't want them to rip them up. Have you ever heard of 3D icons, Father and guests, and are they permissible? Not statuary per se. I'm not sure what a 3D is. That like you're taking like the iconography, you're kind of like applying like a 3D model to it? I mean, like I've seen like animations that look like that. I'd be very afraid of them. They shouldn't move. Icons aren't supposed to do that. So, but
maybe he's just talking about the style, like more of like a Western style iconography.
Well, I'm not sure because maybe if you could specify a little more out of timer, because that would help a lot. Because a little bit lost there. Let's see here, and then Atomic Lead, interesting answer. Okay, thank you. Glad we could help. Kippering Crawford, you're still talking, buddy. Let's see here. I do not find Dcn Joseph to be a trustworthy person. I believe that was Father Enoch who said it, when I consider him pretty trustworthy. But you know who I don't consider trustworthy? People who don't listen to simple instructions. So I'm going to put you in timeout. I don't know what that means, but that's what's about to happen. And so, okay. So in any case, send a link to something timer. That'd be great. And so, we're discussing icons, why they're venerating. Opposing icon veneration is Protestantizing. Mickey Mick said, I agree. We generally agree. What scared me is that I've heard of people who actually, there's not too many anymore, thankfully. Better candidates are coming into churches. But I've even heard of people back when I first became Orthodox where there were clergy who were kind of pretending to venerate icons but secretly just walking away. And it's horrible. I think that, over time what we're going to see, though, is that the tradition bears itself out. And it always comes out on top. And so the tradition of the veneration of icons, I think, is again, St. John of Damascus, as Scooter pointed out, the icon reflects our theology. It's inseparable from the worship of the church. From a practical standpoint, if a person has no icons and they're in a prison cell for persecution, obviously, that's understandable, but you get what I'm saying. Let's see here. So while we're waiting for that link, anything you guys wanted to talk about?
I think they covered everything. And actually, you're breaking up a lot on my end, so I'm getting every other word.
Shut the video off. It'll help.
Oh, you'll miss out on the hat.
All right.
Turn.
Let's see here. Okay, so, Scooter, you got anything? Okay.
No, I don't think we have. I have anything to add.
All right. Okay, it says here timer sent the link, so I'm going to switch to live chat in case I missed something. All right, let's take a look at this icon. Oh, you mean 3D printed icons? Because 3D printed icons are fine. They're just using the principles of mathematics to copy what iconographers have done for centuries. You know, a woodwork like this would have been done by hand. That's venerable. But in any case, I'm not. You know, again, it's taking the fedora back. Well, it's in any case. So again, one of the reasons we have Craig on is because you didn't get a chance to talk about your experience in debating with Eric Ibarra. We'll be having him on our show next week. But tell us a little bit about how that felt and how that went about. Like how did that all happen?
It was, be honest, it was sort of random. Eric obviously has Facebook groups, and I've been debating them online in those different Facebook groups. And I think he wanted to have it out more in more detail, but it was really organized by Mike Lofton, who's pretty much starting. He's trying to start a YouTube channel and a website and everything for himself, and trying to get content, and so that's really more what it came out from. That I was actually surprised he agreed to it. Man, this is why I'm not a good debater, because I give very long-winded answers. In fact, this started out with Mike asking me about the issue of reception, and there's a YouTube video on it, actually, on my YouTube channel, and he wanted to have it out more.
What is the YouTube channel so that the users know?
Oh, my YouTube.
Yeah,
I'm not quite sure. It's just
when you find it, put it in the chat for everyone. So that
I think it's actually still reformedchristiantheology.com. I don't think I've ever updated its name. Something like that. But it's what surprised me was how many people followed the debate. I wouldn't say it was viral by any means of the imagination, but they both have 400 views, and I think a lot of it actually speaks to Eric's following specifically. But even my spiritual father, who I didn't think was going to watch, I saw you in that debate. You were good, and I'm like, I was pretty surprised, actually.
I think it's less. I think it was less Eric, and it's more the fact that Orthodox have not historically. They used to 100 years ago, but ever since ecumenism got big, apologetics was kind of tossed down. But now that apologetics is coming back, we look for it. There's people looking for Orthodox apologetic stuff all the time. So an Orthodox debating a Roman Catholic, that's I think that's part of the reason they're scared to come on here. So you got them on. So hey, congrats on that.
Well, and so did you. I think a big thing is that I've argued for years now with Eric on historical grounds and a lot of things, and that's really my background in anything academic is history. Like, I'm only published one thing that's peer reviewed. It has to do with Neoplatonism. It doesn't really have to do with theology. But, I know some things about historical documents and proper historiography. And so for that reason, I think Eric, being that he's big into the secondary sources and what the scholars are saying about a lot of these things in the early church, that
he's really
big on secondary
sources.
I mean, if you're a Roman Catholic, you kind of have their sources, right? Because you have to make sense of a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense given the dogmas that you have, right?
Yeah,
so secondary sources that kind of distort reality, and then you kind of reinterpret those secondary sources, and now you can make sense of your crazy dogmas. See what I'm saying?
Well, a lot of it is, I've noticed that a lot of things within Roman Catholicism must be within its interpretive lens. And so that a secondary source that already frames it in those terms, is very friendly to someone reading it in that way. But it's at least I think Eric saw me more as a worthy adversary of such, and I do think that, like you said, it's not a lot of Orthodox Catholic debates, and the issues that we often do debate over, we don't really actually cover what the other side really thinks, right? So, like, how many Orthodox sources that talk about, let's say, the Filioque will just go over the Photian, synthesis and really not do justice to a lot of Western thought on that matter pre-schism and stuff like that. So there's a lot of speaking past each other and a lot of monologue and not really a lot of dialogue, even if it's two people disputing one each other's claims.
Well, that's funny because Scooter's mentioned this to me before. But one of the things that we talked about is the Hildebrand thesis that Father Enoch and I have talked about on this show many times, and that gets that's much more difficult because of the amount of secondary literature that's been written based on presuppositions in the ninth and 10th centuries, even about the West. For example, it's often assumed that by the time of the schism, the West was, largely using the Filioque. And that's not true. Historically, the Filioque was barely used outside of Rome and some parts of Germany, and it wasn't even used fully in Rome until 1014. So, kind of these monolithic arguments about the West are very mistaken. And so these are things that, we kind of have to go back to the primary sources to point out, because otherwise people will just assume that the secondary sources are correct.
Well, yeah, we tend to reinterpret our history with what we see in the present. And so let's say if you and I have a conversation, we're relatively plain spoken and there's not a lot of shades of gray. Then we just presume when we read an ancient writing and speak in his mind, that's exactly what he means. Or let's say you're in the West now and they're all using unleavened bread for the Eucharist. So, tons of Roman Catholic people that are educated just think, well, then they must have always, used unleavened bread, even though archaeology, they, would go against that. And it speaks to, interestingly enough, that even without an imperial structure like the Eastern Roman Empire, the West was able to standardize a lot of practices very successfully. And I'm not quite sure the reasons why. It's sort of like how the liturgy of St. Chrysostom pretty much took over all of Orthodoxy pretty much after the Byzantine Empire is really in its twilight at that point. And we've lost a lot of our liturgical diversity without really any sort of, overt cause, right? That's forcing people to conform. So it's like, yeah, that is interesting. That because like even the sign of the cross in the West became backwards. I mean, they used to do it like we did.
Innocent III knew the Orthodox sign of the cross. In his description, he describes it as doing it the way the Orthodox do.
I mean, full immersion baptism. I mean, Saint Thomas Aquinas, not Saint Thomas, but Thomas Aquinas. Sorry, I'm so used to how he's referred to in the West. Thomas Aquinas talks about it explicitly that it's done by full immersion. And so like all these things that are taken for granted in the West, I think it's the way it was always done. And it's even funnier. You'll hear Protestant apologists, now let's say R.C. Sproul, who's dead, he would say, oh, well, sprinkling's how the early church did it. And it's
you hear
and like, well, stuff. Yeah, but again, that's a issue of when people take a modern practice and they just read into the past. They look at one painting that looks like, oh, that must be sprinkling. And then they presume, well, then that's because that's what I do now. That's the way it must have always been.
Well, speaking of crazy things, since we had a crazy group last week calling itself True Orthodox and had its own craziness, now Timer has found another heretical group with the Link Coltrane Church. I assume that is referring to the church, the quote-unquote St. John Coltrane African Orthodox Church. The African Orthodox Church was originally an Anglican breakoff from the time of Marcus Garvey that originally was an attempt to create an autocephalous Orthodox Church in Africa that, kind of would feed back to the motherland, and it didn't quite work out that way. And the AOC since has become just as liberal as any Anglican group. But the Coltrane Church is unique in that they decided that they were going to declare John Coltrane, the musician, a saint. And so if you make the mistake of clicking that link, you'll see his quote-unquote icon. I have seen video of this. They had it once on some public television broadcast talking about the life of John Coltrane. And you had people dancing around, listening to jazz music, hipsters. I mean, it was just the strangest thing I had ever seen. But what it did not look like was in any way, shape, or form a worship service. It looked like a form of entertainment. And I think that, as I don't know what John Coltrane's religious beliefs were. I think he was nominally Christian of some kind, although I think he may have tended towards spiritualism. But I think he would be very, very embarrassed by seeing this organization. Let's see here. Oh, Kiprian, you're back. Well, that's a nicer way of putting it. All are welcome to come to my Facebook page at Kiprian Crawford. Here's the thing. Again, no one is attacking icons of God the Father. It's like, and if we're going to talk about this, because there was a schism in the Matthewites, if you're not familiar, anyone here, that's the group of the Greek Old Calendarists that followed Bishop Matthew of Bristena. There was a group in 1995 that declared that the other group was iconoclast because they said that the typology of the icon of God the Father was incorrect. They still venerated the icons of God the Father. So you're not even arguing with people who disagree with venerating icons of God the Father. And nobody in this group, neither Father Enoch nor my wife, would not venerate an icon of God the Father. What you're doing is you're creating a straw man to break down because you want to have exposure. And that's why I began blocking you. And I'm doing it again. Because, frankly, you are more interested in a fake debate than a real discussion.
Yeah. Just to add to that, like, I think basically the position of all of us is just that, like, the normative approach to iconography is to generally not depict the Father. I mean, with Cyprian reject our icons historically, it generally be Father, and there are historic arguments. Again, there are theological arguments against it. I mean, who has really an argument against that?
Yeah, but nobody. What he's trying to say is no. Nobody's ever argued this point. Nobody's ever debated this point, which isn't true.
He's just wrong.
Yeah, but what he wants is attention for being wrong, and it's attention I'm not giving him anymore.
Yeah.
So, anyway, if are there any more questions? I think we've covered the amazing Coltrane Church. I guess that's all right. Timer can help us find our heretical body calling itself Orthodox of the Week. And with that, we've only got 8 minutes for our official ending. So if you want, there's no more questions. First off, I'd like to thank both of you for being on. Craig, I will see what your Facebook address, your video address is. It's Reformed Christian Apologetics. Scooter, as we know, your YouTube channel is God Save the Tsar. Everyone who hasn't already, like and subscribe to all of them, because the more Orthodox apologetics we get out there, the more people will become Orthodox apologists and defend the faith, and the churches will be filled and great stuff, and we'll be heroes. Okay, that part's not true, but the point is, maybe, who knows? But in any case, all right. So timer's going to go look for next week's heretical group to look at. And guys, if you have any comments or any last words to the group or me, or
I would say I know that Reason Theology. Eric and I will be partaking in a roundtable on rebaptism, which is an interesting subject.
Yeah, we had it out on that one a little while back.
A little bit. I don't think we're really.
No, we weren't fighting over
that different. You're just against priests giving people leeway.
Yeah, exactly. Just make the decision. If you're a priest listening and he asks, "How should I be?" Don't give him a choice. Just say, "This is how it's going to happen." Leave it alone. Okay. All right, Scooter, you got anything left before we close up?
No, just thank you so much for having me on the show. show. It's been a pleasure. Nice talking with both of you.
And hopefully, you know, I mean, Father Enoch is always looking for more co-hosts too. So if you guys ever want to pop in again, when either of us is on or both of us is on, just let us know. We'll send you a link.
Sure.
And
Sounds good.
all right. Well, everyone who is listening, thank you so much for listening again. Everyone have a good night. Thank you for everyone in the chat. Thank you for everyone talking. Have a good night, all.
God bless.